All right, welcome to this, our third lecture in topic 2 for week 2, what we're calling the global environment, part of our topic this week of the business environment generally. Today we are going to talk about just what is out there when we're thinking of international business, what makes business international. We'll talk about the structure of the global economy. What are the sort of divisions in the global economy? What are the useful ways to segment and think about the global economy? What are some of the challenges inherent in international management as opposed to purely domestic management within our home country? And what are some of the considerations when competing internationally? What do we mean when we talk about international business? Well, a domestic business is one that basically stays home. It gets all its resources uh, more or less within its home country, and it sells all of its resources within its home country. Now, that doesn't mean that all the inputs come from its own country, but simply that its partners are based within its home country, right? You might be buying your coffee beans at Rouse's, and those coffee beans didn't come from Louisiana, but the people you're dealing with are local. So here we think about, for example, your local hair salon or a restaurant that does things locally. An international business is based in a single country, but has a meaningful share of its resources or revenues from other countries. So places like Walmart, Lowe's, and Starbucks, they are all American countries. They have America as their home country, but they have, for example, retail locations in the case of these firms in other countries. I can go to Walmart in Canada, I can go to Starbucks in England, and so they generate revenues in other countries. A multinational business is doing both. It's getting its supplies. It might have production in one country that isn't its home country. It may get money from a second country, and it may sell in a third country. So countries like Coca-Cola and Ford are very much multinational firms. They have bases. They make, for example, Ford will have plants that produce in Mexico. It may get its financing from the USA, and it sells in Southeast Asia. So it's a multinational business. It's got different parts of its operations all over the world. And then we have this idea of a global business, and it really transcends the national home base altogether. It almost operates as in the world as one big global market, or almost without boundaries. And these are this in some ways might be a bit of a dubious label, but it is used. And it's used and applied to generally firms that operate on such a wide global scale that it's hard to even determine, well, where are we going to say that is their home country? Perhaps they even have their incorporation, their main incorporation is in a tax haven. They sell to multiple global markets, and they have production in multiple markets as well. Apple is very much a global business. So with some of these businesses too, you end up having these conversations about tax evasion because they're, like I said, they're incorporated maybe in the Cayman Islands or in Jersey or somewhere, and they're sort of a free-floating, freewheeling cosmopolitan corporation. So this flows on a spectrum in terms of the level of international activity. Purely domestic business, where you're getting your haircut maybe, is the lowest level, zero internationalization, right up to these global businesses like Apple that are doing, have operations maybe in scores of countries. Some of the trends in the international business environment. Following World War II, the US emerged from World War I actually as the dominant economic powerhouse. But really, that was really emphasized following World War II, that the destruction that laid waste to parts of London and Germany, which were sort of the two economic powerhouses before World War II, really gave ascendancy to the USA. Now, the interesting thing here is that these European areas, Japan, same thing. Japan was decimated by World War II. and the USA really was dominant, completely dominant for say 20 years afterwards. Don't quote me on the 20 years, but let's say roughly 10 to 20 years, the USA had very few competitors from a regional and national standpoint. Now, come the 70s, 80s, and onwards, some of these companies that had finished rebuilding and they became competitive again on a national basis. Germany rebuilds its industrial base. Japan certainly rebuilds its industrial base. And it mentions here in the textbook that perhaps to some extent the US companies had become complacent. And so all of a sudden you start getting products from Japan, especially cars, vehicles, electronics, that are quite the quality is perhaps better than US quality. There's some interesting stories about what happened when Ford first started looking at these Toyota cars that were coming over, and how impressed the engineers were with the quality of what was being produced in Japan, and wondering how they did it. Other factors, as more countries outside the USA and outside of North America begin to become wealthy and their populations, the middle class grows, this provides market opportunities as well for newer and better products. So you have a couple competing factors here. In one respect, there's new markets for American products as these European, Asian, and developing countries, their middle class grows and they can afford more US style consumption. But at the same time, you also have the flip side of that, which is foreign products from these countries are now coming into the US market, and US companies are having to compete sometimes quite desperately in areas that had once been secure domestic markets, US producers selling to the US population. Couple other terms here that are useful. When we talk about exporting, we're talking about countries that are producing at home and then just selling it, shipping that product over to another country. They haven't made any direct investment in that country. You might think about somebody who's making horse saddles or something, just a local family business, and they're getting orders in like overseas, and they're just filling those orders by sending the product by mail or shipment or whatever. Importing is the opposite side of that. You're bringing it in from another country, from abroad. With importing and exporting, the advantages are it's the easiest way and the lowest risk way to enter a new market. All you have to do is send the product. The only real risk involved is the risk of shipping, say. You don't need to really do any adaptation. You're just sending the exact same product that you were making before and selling to your domestic market. Now you're selling that, or you're sending it to a market in another country. The disadvantages of that tend to be on two dimensions. One of them is that they're often subject to political interference, if you like, taxes and tariffs designed to protect the producers in whatever market you're exporting to. There's also, of course, higher transportation expenses. If you are exporting things that are very large or bulky, or require refrigeration or whatever, that's more expensive than selling to your domestic market, of course. But then there's also the local needs of that market. The product you're selling in your domestic market may really need some kind of modification or customization if it's going to get a larger audience in the market you're selling to. I'm going to use the term home and host market. Home is where your firm is based, and the host market is another country where you're either exporting to or perhaps even thinking about making some direct investment in and opening up operations in that country, in that host market. You may need to make customizations to satisfy more customers in your host market versus staying strictly domestic. Moving up the commitment ladder here. So the easiest form of internationalization is just exporting. We're just going to take what we're selling here and just send it overseas. Slightly higher level of commitment is when you get into licensing. Now maybe we're going to have a company overseas that we allow to use our name, our brand, and they just pay us a royalty to use it, and they sell it. They sell our product, our brand over there. One of the advantages is it's very easy. It's slightly, as always, the more you commit, the more you risk. So there's slightly more risk in that the licensees, they might take your product. Maybe you give them license to produce a drug overseas. You have the license to a particular drug, and you let them produce it over there, there's a chance they might take that patent, take that drug, and just start producing it without you. Or they reverse engineer it and find a way to work around your patent. This is very common when it comes to knowledge-based industries. Someone who started off as your licensee figures out through that license how to do what you do. And not only maybe do they exploit the market that you were in with their own product, maybe they even come back to your country now and start competing with you on your home turf. Another sort of lower commitment way to compete in a host market would be a strategic alliance. Two firms cooperating either with some skin in the game through a joint venture, or you buy equity in your partner, or maybe it's just an informal handshake or contract agreement to cooperate. And there's that example there. Joint venture is escalating level of commitment. Now you're partnering with a firm and you're both putting equity into a third firm. That keeps you committed. You can't just walk away now. It does make it easier to enter the market, especially if you're creating a joint venture with a local company in the host market. That's often a good way to get the skills that you need and the knowledge you need for that specific market. But now you're sharing ownership, 50-50 perhaps, and you don't have as much control. This is often a consideration when investing in China, for example. American firms, at least in the past, possibly I believe still now as well, have had to take local partners and have joint ventures, and that limits your control. It also exposes you, just like licensing, to to leakage of your private knowledge. You now are exposing your company's secrets and patents to your partner, your joint venture partner. Then the largest form of commitment is direct investment. You are headquartered in your home country, but you are going to have a wholly owned subsidiary in the host country, right? Maybe you're going to have GMC Canada or GM Motors Canada, and you're going to have a plant in Windsor, Ontario, which is an actual example that's going to produce cars in Canada for the Canadian market. It's got this example here, the maquiladoras. These are plants that are in northern Mexico, right along the US border, that are given tax breaks by the Mexican government. So that's a form of direct investment. These car factories or manufacturing plants open up a plant just on the other side of the border. The Mexican government treats them favorably. It gives them tax breaks to attract that investment. Governments are often very interested in attracting foreign direct investment, right? Please, BMW, come and open up a plant in South Carolina. It'll create a lot of jobs for my constituents if I'm a senator or a congressman in that area. When we're competing in a global market, how does that change things? Well, in a sense, it's still just competition. Those Porter's five forces that we were looking at still apply, but now at a bare minimum, it's going to be the same level of competition, probably more. If there's any other firms involved now that we're in an international industry, that means more competition, more firms competing for customers. Now we have to compete with multinationals on our own turf. Now we're the big three car manufacturer, but we also got to compete with Japanese cars and British cars and German cars. Also, it's a higher level of complexity. Now I'm a manager in an international firm. I have to think about managing people who speak a different language, who have different customs, who have a different legal employment law. Really ups the complexity. One of the key considerations then is, well, do we focus on sort of an overall global market, or do we focus on one region? The truth of the matter is firms do both, but even very globalized firms will often have certain regions that really stick out as the center. And you'll often see regional breakdowns if you look at a firm's 10K, where they're generating the bulk of their revenues. It might be still in their home region. It might be in, say, the Southeast Asian region, or the Western European region, or the what's called the Latin American and Caribbean region. Oftentimes, there's still some kind of focus. So we've got a little list here, sort of summarizing the escalating levels of commitment from import-export all the way to direct investment. What are the disadvantages? What are the advantages, and what are the disadvantages? Some of this stuff is going to for sure come up on the quizzes and the exams. So this is a handy little summary to look at, either in the slides that I'll post or in the textbook. So that's just broad level overview of what we mean when we talk about internationalization, everything from exporting to partnerships to foreign direct investment. But how do we speak about the international environment and what are some of the differences? Well, um, we also often talk about the different types of economies that countries have or even regions have when we're talking about international business. The one that we're familiar with here in the USA, of course, is what's called a market economy or a free market. And that the idea here is that business is owned privately and business owners are pretty much left to their own devices to make their own decisions, determine how much they're going to produce, how much they want to sell, determine their own prices. Countries that follow this model are United States, Canada, Japan, UK, France, Germany, Sweden. And resources are allocated by the laws of supply and demand. If a resource becomes scarce and demand goes, if demand is exceeding supply, the suppliers are going to raise their prices. Other people in the market are probably going to see that, and more companies are going to come in and start providing that product or service in theory, because they're going to want to get in on the action, which theoretically increases competition and lowers those prices back down to the competitive balance or equilibrium. But private property is the main characteristic of a free market economy. Now, of course, there's no perfectly free market economy. Even the USA, which is quite pro-markets, has tariffs and subsidies and protects its farmers and has various protections for local industry. But if we look at a summary here, we can see as well, we have the different regions when we talk about not just the type of economy, but how do we label these regions? Well, we have our mature markets here in North America, of course, in Europe. It used to be just Western Europe, but increasingly now Eastern Europe. The Berlin Wall came down in '89, and increasingly the entire European region is at least nominally a market economy. Southeast Asia, or Pacific Asia, has become more market oriented. Middle East, some market economies there. Australia, of course, it has that European heritage that makes it very much a market economy as well. Market systems are areas that engage in trade with one another. So you get what's kind of these treaty blocks or blocks, parts of the world that have agreed to trade with each other on a favorable basis. Some notable market blocks are, of course, the NAFTA bloc, or now the USMCA bloc. Canada, USA, Mexico has favorable trade and treaty agreements related to promoting lower tariffs and more exchange of goods between those three countries. NAFTA was replaced by USMCA in 2020. You have the European Union, which is another block of countries that have committed to lower tariffs and increased trade and facilitating trade between its member countries, 27 right now. You have blocks in Southeast Asia as well. China is becoming increasingly important leader as the second largest economy in the world, second only to the US. China is an interesting one. It has private enterprise, but very much directed by the state. So it's sometimes it's called a state enterprise or state-led market economy. Then you have these, China is also listed here as a high growth, high potential economy. Sometimes you hear about the BRICS, BRIC, Brazil, Russia, India, China. Here they also list Vietnam and South Africa. These are countries that are very much up and coming and developing quickly. Still, maybe they have some drawbacks in terms of institutions. Maybe they have authoritarian governments like in Russia or China, or have still high levels of poverty like in Brazil and India, but are industrializing, and the trend of their development is very much upward trending. So they're high potential / high growth. Barriers there might be lack of wealth and infrastructure issues, especially when you get into like rural India or rural China. There's this interesting Middle East classification issue because countries like Dubai, Saudi Arabia are some of the wealthiest countries in the world, and yet politically they're governed by dictatorships. There's cultural instability, political instability, maybe terrorism at a higher level than you would find in Europe or North America. But they have this wealth due to the presence of oil. Um, Venezuela would be here, but they're politically so fraught that they don't even that wealth that should be there because of oil and gas development isn't there. So it's an interesting case all on its own. Cuba, another interesting one that's remains somewhat shut off, but it's very close to the USA. And if those barriers were to come down, and communist government was to be put in the past, some real opportunities there for trade, obviously, with the USA. So a number of different growth and potential growth areas, as well as mature economies to be considered in this international map when looking at business opportunities globally. A couple really important trade organizations that you will hear if you watch the business press or listen to the news. First, you had GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, and then the WTO. And of course, that they exist because essentially free trade only works if everyone's playing by the same rules. If I'm not putting any tariffs on your country's imports and you're sending stuff over here, but you're putting imports on all my, or tariffs on all my exports, I'm going to be in trouble. It's going to put all my local firms out of business and favor you. So really, you do need these structures in place to have a free international free market system to keep everybody playing by the same rules. We're all going to lower our tariffs. Otherwise, somebody's going to get a bad deal, essentially. You're going to flood my market with cheap goods. It's going to destroy my own domestic industry, and I don't get anything out of it. That's if you want to look at the source of the disagreements, especially say between USA and China, it's all about tariffs and trade wars. And there's all sorts of ways that countries do this. So talk about maybe devaluing, maybe we don't impose a tariff, but we devalue our currency deliberately so that our products are cheaper in your market, which is essentially like putting it, and your products are more expensive, which is basically a sneaky way of introducing a tariff. The principle that governs these WTO and GATT treaties is this idea of the most favored nation principle. Basically, whatever's the best deal that you're giving to someone, you got to give it to all the members. So if I'm in WTO and I establish a really favorable treaty with another country, I got to offer it to everyone. It's kind of like that classroom. What the teacher said, if you're gonna, do you have enough to share with everyone, right? If you're gonna do this for one country, you got to do it for everyone. 164 member countries in the WTO. Their principles are here. If you want to join the club, you got to open your market to trade. There's an assessment process as part of that. Moving on to how does operating internationally, what kind of challenges does that present? Going back to that idea of environmental challenges. Now we have an international environment. Well, what goes on in that international environment? Well, there's an international differences now in those economic systems, those pest factors, right? International political situations. There may be differences in infrastructure that we have to bridge between no pun intended, between our country and the other country. Maybe we're used to an environment like the USA where we can get things from point A to B and then to port relatively easily. And now we're moving to a country where perhaps there is high levels of lawlessness and robbery, or the infrastructure just isn't there. We're going to need to build some roads. Maybe the political situation is risky. Maybe there's a big cultural divide between our country and that country. Maybe the finance environment is Islamic and interest is taboo and prohibited. So we have to find different ways and get used to different methods of financing what we're doing over there. Maybe there's national holidays that they observe and we don't. All sorts of extra environmental challenges when you're operating on the international stage. Diving a bit deeper here, there may be different property ownership can be a big one. What's property law? Do I have any legal recourse if I get into a disagreement with another firm to sue them? Do I have any standing? Is there reliable courts? What are the natural resources in that country? Perhaps there is a resource that I'm dependent on, like steel, that I can't get as easily in a country I'm considering operating in, or even just things like clean water if I'm bottling some soft drink. Maybe I need to have part of my firm publicly owned, or I'm forced into a joint venture agreement with a local partner, like in China. These are all part of the economic environment that now I'm having to consider both the one at home and the one in the host market. I'm having to consider two or more instead of just the one I was dealing with domestically. Maybe the school system isn't good, and if I want to send expat workers there, they're going to want good schools for their kids, or maybe I need skilled workers, and I need then to the school system. I have to deal with the quality of the education of my workers, depending on how that system works in the host market. All these infrastructure considerations. It may have there may be, like I said, high fraught political risk. Perhaps it's Venezuela and sort of pre-Maduro, and I don't know if I invest in a mine there and the government changes, they might just take my mine. They might expropriate me. I have to think about government stability. Maybe I'm worried that I'm a big company and there's going to be protests. Maybe I'm trying to open up a Walmart in Germany, and I know that small businesses are going to fight back politically, and I have to worry about maybe protests or boycotts or whatever in this new host market. But maybe there's an upside. Maybe the host market is going to offer me tax cuts, and they're trying to attract FDI. Instead, they're going to give me favorable lending, they're going to give me tax cuts or some kind of other subsidy to go and take my business there. Here's some different ways that international trade is controlled. You have tariffs, just a straightforward tax imposed on imported goods. A quota is just a hard limit. You're allowed to export this much into our country, and then that's it, right? You hit your quota, that's it. Maybe there's a voluntary agreement, or maybe with some firms it's observed, and there's an example in the textbook, I forget which company they mentioned, but some firms will just avoid exporting too much because they don't want to have a tariff imposed. If they know that, hey, if we push our luck with how many cheap cars we send to this market, we could ruin a good thing here. So we're going to voluntarily restrain ourselves. We looked at these different markets that will have, sometimes they're called economic communities or trade communities, a few different ones here, the Caribbean Common Market, Latin American market, different treaty regions or economic communities that have agreements with each other that are part of this political legal environment. If we're operating in the same political legal environment, that might be a bit easier than if we're trying to bridge into another one that we don't have an agreement with. If we're the US and we want to trade with Czech Republic, well, now we're bridging two separate economic communities, and that's part of our political legal environment. Cultural environment. This is a really interesting one. And a lot of firms don't realize what a barrier, maybe the political legal system or environment is quite favorable, but there's actually quite a big cultural divide that hasn't been recognized beforehand. Might be something obvious like language, might be something to do with how cultural approaches to time. Certain cultures are very rigidly time bound. If you make a meeting, you show up on time, or even you show up 5 minutes early. You go to another culture, and if they said we'll meet you at noon, it just meant sometime in the afternoon or sometime that day. Also, the way that words are used, or the commitment that is implied by saying yes or agreeing informally, but actually you think you had a handshake deal, but actually the person in that culture was just being polite to you, and you don't have a deal at all, and you didn't realize it. These unspoken cultural aspects can cause companies to stumble, can cause international managers to stumble. You have a guy called Hofstede who identified a few different dimensions of cultural values. We have them listed here. He's done a lot of Hofstede's done a lot of this work. You'll hear about Hofstede's dimensions of cultural values. And he identified 5 dimensions that differ across cultures. And each of them is a spectrum that cultures vary on, that's been shown in his surveys, that cultures can kind of vary on quite significantly. First one there is the social orientation. Are we a highly individualistic culture or quite a collective culture? If it's an individualistic culture, we're going to for example, need to motivate employees differently. An individualistic cultures I'm going to want to see performance-based pay, for example, whereas in a collective culture, I don't want to stick out from my peers. I want to be rewarded as part of a team effort. Power orientation. IKEA is an interesting example on this respect. Uh, Swedish culture is very low. They say low power distance or low or power tolerance. Um, if I'm a Swedish worker, I feel perfectly justified speaking my full mind to my seniors, and I don't sort of use any special terms of respect. They're just holding an office different to mine, but kind of a fairly flat view of hierarchy and authority that might not fly in another country. So actually, when IKEA took their management model to Germany, the Germans have a lot more power respect. So um, someone who's in authority, you would speak to them differently, and to sort of have someone in authority speak to you in an informal way goes against what you are used to. It makes you uncomfortable. You think you're being kind and very democratic, and actually it's just upsetting the apple cart a bit there. So power orientation is a big consideration. You have what's called uncertainty acceptance. Some cultures are much more, you might say, a higher risk appetite than others. Some cultures might put a high value on avoiding uncertainty. You certainly see this with working cultures. In France, employees, the unions promote very low risk. If you get a job in France, they say you've kind of got it for life. It's kind of like being a tenured professor. Other cultures might be more willing to take a risk on a good opportunity, and have more loose and flexible employment laws, or inflexible laws about new ventures, right? Maybe the bankruptcy laws are more favorable. It's easier to declare bankruptcy and try something new, right? That might reflect more uncertainty acceptance, like in the US case. There's goal orientation. Do we put, is it kind of a situation where, shark eat shark or dog eat dog? It's just business, right? When we're friends, but when it's business, I'm out to achieve the goals of my business. Or is it a culture that sees that in a very negative light, perhaps like South Korean culture or Japanese culture, where relationship is very important and relationship and family are prioritized above what might be acceptable as just business as usual in a country that values has a more aggressive goal orientation. And then finally, that time orientation I spoke about. It is a long-term outlook. Are we okay to be patient with our investment, for example, and willing to assume a very long payback period, or that rewards will come sometime in the distant future? Or is it more of I want to see a return every quarter, and if I don't, I'm selling this stock? Is it that kind of short-term outlook? So 5 different dimensions that can vary greatly across cultures, and need to be considered by a manager who's thinking of bridging those cultures. Now you're not just dealing with one cultural environment, to return to that first lecture on the external environment. Now you might have multiple cultural environments, all of which can vary along 5 dimensions, which, if you do the math, the number of possible combinations here now becomes almost infinite, and you're having to adapt to different external environments depending on each host country. Globalization, organizational size. You tend to see, obviously, bigger organizations are more likely to be global and vice versa. Global organizations are more likely to just be larger organizations, if only because it requires a greater allocation of resources. You have to have managers that are more capable. It requires more of the managers, but it also requires more in cash. You're going to have to be paying probably transaction costs, legal fees to set up in a new market. It's going to be expensive to pay employees to be operating across borders, and to just have more staff than you have in your strictly domestic market. So the largest firms in the world tend to be global or multinational corporations, and vice versa. Walmart, Apple. If you look at a list of Forbes, Fortune 500 companies, most of them are probably going to be global companies. Medium-sized organizations now tend to still be quite domestic. I worked in the small medium enterprise part of my bank when I was banking, and most of my customers were domestic, but especially with advances in technology and communications technology, it's easier to operate internationally. I even had one very small, especially at export. If you're selling a specialized product for which there's a global market, I had someone who sold really high quality stereo equipment manufactured in Canada, and he exported it globally. It was sort of $20,000 components, and there was a global market. Small firm, but he exported. Um, Small organizations, you're more likely just to be domestic and maybe serve multinational corporations. Um, Perhaps so oil field services is a great example. You're contracting to work with very large multinational organizations, but you're just doing maybe pipe inspections locally in Louisiana for a big multinational company. Maybe some simple import-export, like my client I mentioned who did the stereo exporting. So you tend to see a correlation there between the level of internationalization and the side of the firm. How does this apply to our four activities of management now, if we're thinking internationally? Obviously, you're planning and making decisions now on based on a much more complex environment with more competition. You're spanning multiple boundaries culturally, politically, etc., and there's more firms now to think about. So you need to be addressing those critical issues on multiple fronts. Organizing, well, now you need to exercise uh, you're moving managers around and moving resources around across a much bigger chessboard. So you have to devote more thought to your organizational structure. Maybe you need to open up, you have a wholly owned subsidiary, maybe you need to open up divisions now that to address regional structures. So maybe you have a Latin American division now, maybe you have a North American division, maybe you have just a domestic division and an international division if you're sort of more medium sized. But a lot of firms, when they start to get bigger and grow internationally, they'll have geographically based divisions, perhaps as well as product-based divisions. So maybe you have an R&D division, but you also have a sales division that focuses on EMEA, Europe, Middle East, and Africa, right? So your organizational structure will tend to change the more international you become. If you're going to lead in an organizational in an international organization, you're probably going to need international experience. So these big international firms will often have manager training programs that expose their young managers or their developing managers to different cultures. They'll send them on a deployment to another country to give them experience in China or in Latin America, and maybe even rotate them through multiple countries so that they can develop the skills to lead across multiple different cultures, to become fluent and sort of able to negotiate those different cultures and those cultural differences as they lead staff and employees that come from different backgrounds. And then controlling becomes obviously much more complex. Now you're having to comply with tax laws and maybe tax codes that vary quite greatly. Maybe you have employment law that's different, and your HR, your head of global HR, has to think about employment law in the European Union and employment law in China and employment law in the USA, and coordinate their staff, his or her staff, in multiple markets with multiple legal systems. So everything, the complexity just really increases across the board when now you're introducing the international environment, which really, of course, is just multiple national environments and everything's just multiplied. The complexity is multiplied, the scale is multiplied and made much more demanding upon the skills of the manager. Oftentimes you'll have to really up your game and undergo more years of experience, perhaps. Perhaps you start off in a domestic market, but if you want to move up into an international role, into one of these top management positions, it doesn't happen until later in your career because the skills that you need are that much more advanced. And maybe you need some more training in the organization. Good. All right. That's all for week 2 here. As always, if you need anything from me, if you have any questions, feel free to pick up the phone, shoot me an email, show up at my office door during office hours, whatever you like. I look forward to seeing your discussion posts on Packback. There's a lot of material here to investigate and ask curious questions about. So I look forward to seeing what you guys come up with there, and we'll see you next week. All the best.